Hello. Hello, class. Welcome back to Introduction to Philosophy, 1301. So we'll continue on where we left off. Uh, Today we're doing Chapter 10. It's called From Hobbes to Hume. Basically, this chapter is very mostly all about epistemology. So the study of how do we get the study of how we get knowledge and what is knowledge. So basically, there's two different approaches that we're going to investigate more in depth in this lecture uh, to epistemology. The first approach, not the first, but one of the approaches is rationalism, and this was really well expounded by Descartes. So Descartes is the one that really develops the philosophy and the approach of rationalism in this modern period. Uh, and then the other camp, the other approach to epistemology is empiricism. And in this chapter, we're going to focus on the British empiricist, uh, ending up with Hume, who's really more of a skeptic. He takes empiricism to the extreme, and he ends up with skepticism. We're also going to talk about some other continental modern philosophers, such as Baruch Spinoza and Leibniz, you know, George Wilhelm Leibniz. And both of these guys also propose this kind of like a combination of both this rationalist empiricist view, but it's a unique approach to their epistemology. We will briefly talk about those two philosophers. There's countless others of other empiricists and rationalists that were just as influential as these philosophers that we're going to talk about in this chapter, but we're just going to focus on a couple of them. All right. So let's begin with Thomas Hobbes. Thomas Hobbes is a really interesting character. Let me give you a little bit of context, a little bit of historical background on Thomas Hobbes. When he was born, when he was being born, while his mother was giving birth to Thomas Hobbes, to little baby Hobbes, uh, the Spanish Armada was threatening to invade Britain. So this is right smack in the middle of these imperial wars between Spain and Great Britain. Long story short, Great Britain becomes superior. They defeat the Spanish Armada. Uh, they have a strong monarchy. Uh, and this is like the background. This is like the zeitgeist, the society, the politics that Hobbes grows into. Um, so Hobbes, it's said that when he was born a twin with fear. That shit was hitting the fan when he was born. Pretty much for the whole life, for the rest of his life, he would see strife, whether it's in these imperial wars or whether it's in civil wars in this European continent. Um, he was often forced to flee England, so he's from England. Um, because he was a monarchist, he was a royalist, so he believed in a strong monarchy. So the Civil War in England at this point was all about whether we should keep a monarchy, the government should be kept, the power of the government should be kept with a strong monarch, a centralized monarchy, or these ideas of the Enlightenment that were sprouting about, which was about democracy and this republicanism. That we don't need a democracy, we don't need a monarchy, but power should lay in the hands of the people, and a specific kind of people though, but the people nonetheless. So we have this rise to republicanism, and in England in particular, there's a rise of what we call parliamentarianism. So we have parliaments in England. So instead of the power of the government to execute laws and enforce laws, before it was held with the monarch, with the king of England and the queen. During this time period, the Civil War was about shifting that power towards Parliament, this representative body of government. So Parliament basically is kind of like a Congress here, if you want to use that analogy. They have the House of Lords and the House of Commons. It's bicameral, and they propose laws and stuff. So that's like, and eventually the parliamentarians won. So this is one of the reasons why Hobbes had to leave. So it was back and forth, this bakery. So political philosophy was his main emphasis in life, because of all the political turmoil that was happening. It makes sense that he was trying to find some kind of political harmony. How do we find harmony? How do we find justice? Actually, what is the definition of justice? Justice, according to your textbook here, refers to people getting what is fair and what is their due. The core principle in this concept of justice is that it defines a person, a person's due, what is their due, what is their share, their equal share, as equal. So equals should be treated equally. So if all men are equal, then all men should be treated equally, and all men should benefit in the fruits of the state or whatever. So justice refers to the idea that people should get what is fair and what is their due, what is just. And remember, this is one of the main questions that Plato is trying to to uncover and to unpack. What Thomas Hobbes, though, is more preoccupied about is this more particular form of justice, a more particular conceptualization of justice, which is distributive justice. I guess this is a good time to turn this down. Justice, distributive justice. So what does distributive justice mean? It's also known as social justice. And I think this is a more common parlance we use today. Right? What is social justice? And social justice, in the most, I guess, broadest sense, is the fair distribution. Right? So it's distributive. Right? The just distribution, the fair distribution of society's benefits and burdens. So what am I talking about when I say benefits and burdens of a society? So these are things such as jobs, income, property, liberties, rights, welfare, taxes, and public service. Stuff like that. So whatever the state provides, or whatever the state secures. This is distributive justice. It should be all these things, all these benefits and all these burdens. Right? Taxes is a burden. To be taxed it's a burden. Right? You got to pay up. But then you get nice roads or nice schools, or access to Blackboard, for example, because of your taxes or you pay your tuition, whatever. So you give in a little bit of your own liberties, right? This primal liberty, you give up some freedom to the government in order for the government to distribute it equally among equals. This is distributive justice. It's the fair distribution of society's benefits and burdens. Basically, it's material and non-material goods. How do we distribute this stuff among everybody in this society? So there's different approaches to how to do this best. And what Thomas Hobbes formulates, one of the first ones to formulate this theory is what we call contractarianism or social contract theory. So how do we distribute best the material and non-material goods of society among every member in this society that we're creating? So according to Hobbes, is that we need to create a contract between not just amongst each other, but amongst what he calls a Leviathan. The Leviathan. And the Leviathan is this biblical creature, this beast, this monster that's in the ocean. It's a kraken. It's a big octopus that has this big tentacles that reach all across. So once you're in its grasp, you can't get out. And this is the way that Hobbes imagined a government should be. The one that's going to distribute justice, these benefits and goods, these materials and non-material goods among society, should be a strong Leviathan, a strong central government. It could be a king, it could be It can be parliament, for as long as it's strong and has reach all across society, like Leviathan, this big Leviathan. This is what Hobbes begins. So why does he take this approach that he favors a strong monarchy? So he's a royalist. He doesn't want the monarchy to leave. He believes that if we give the power to the parliament, that it's going to create anarchy. We're going to descend into chaos. So in order to avoid chaos, we need a strong leader, a strong government, whether it's a monarch, a king, or a strong centralized government, to keep everybody at bay, and more importantly, to make sure that everybody is obeying this so-called social contract that we're going to make. So, according to Hobbes, in his social contract theory, this Leviathan, in this book that he writes eventually, he takes this approach of justice as saying that justice, the best way that justice is secured and guaranteed among everybody, uh, and make the state legitimate, the government legitimate, legitimize the government, is through an agreement among the citizens and the states. Right? This consent, right? It's about consent. It's an agreement. It's a contract we're making, and this consent could be explicit or implicit, right? Like for example, when you're born into the U.S. here, right? Most of us are American citizens, or I guess naturalized or whatever. But especially when we're born in the U.S., we're naturally born. We're born U.S. citizens. When I was born, I didn't consent to the laws of the land here, to the U.S. Constitution. But just by sharing, right, the benefits and the burdens, right, of this land, by going to school, right, since pre-K all the way up to now, by using the state roads, using the state benefits, whatever. By doing that, I'm implicitly consenting to the agreement. So I don't have to explicitly go and sign the contract. Just by participating in society, you're already implicitly accepting this agreement between you and the state, you and the Leviathan. So we explicitly or implicitly, either or, consent to be governed. So we're giving up some of our liberties, and we're agreeing, we're accepting for somebody else to govern us, for the whole point to secure this justice. So the way that this theory of justice comes about is based upon, so Hobbes has this idea that the state of nature of man, that man's state of nature, the human's state of nature, let's not be sexist like they were, that human state of nature, so what do I mean by, or what does Hobbes mean by state of nature, is our our principal or primordial nature, our state, our status, prior to anything, prior to civilization, prior to any other contact with other people even. How do we come into this world? Right, so think about, like, I don't know, the very first humans here ever, before we made agriculture and civilization discoveries and developments. He says that our state of nature, and our very human nature, basically, is very is a war of every man against every man, or every human is against every human. Every human, right? He just basically takes his pessimistic view that humans are out there to kill each other, because all we care about is our egocentric perseverance, survival, our self-preservation. That's what we really care about. We care about, if there's one apple and there's two of us, I'll kill you to get that apple for myself, to make sure that I survive for the day. That's our state of nature, that we're violent, we're solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. That's our life and the state of nature. It's anarchy, basically. without any principles. Anarchy, that's what anarchy means, right? Anarchy. Uh, Arche means principles, like first foundational principles, and an or a is nothing, taking away principles. So no principles, no institutions, no nothing. It's just chaos, basically, for Hobbes. The state of nature is just a war of every man against every man. There's no code, no culture, no comfort, no justice. So what he states, quote unquote, is this: there is only continual fear and danger of violent death, and the life of man is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. So, but however, though, right, even though we're all very egoistic and we care about our own survival, uh, there is though this internal, I guess, self-interest, right, and this self-preservation, right, is coupled. So we have self-preservation that runs us, that makes us egoistic. So, oh, preservation. Ion, ion, self-preservation and self-interest. That's the state of nature. However, the state of nature is coupled with reason. What am I writing? What I'm saying? It's coupled with reason. Reason is kind of controls our beastly nature, basically. This self-preservation, this drive towards self-preservation and self-interest is coupled with reason. It's kind of like cap over it. Thus, through reason, Hobbes says, we see that we could escape. The only way to escape this state of nature, this war against each other, this war of all against all, as he says, the war of all against all, is it makes perfect reasonable sense to enter into a contract. You know what, guys? There's one apple. There's two of us. Let's make a contract. Let's make a deal. Let's cut that in half. Let's share. You know? And I promise you won't stab me. Now let's use that knife that I was going to stab you with to cut the apple in half instead, and we'll make a deal with that. We'll make a social contract. Right? That makes sense to you? Yes? Okay, cool. We both live, we both eat. Right? This is kind of what Hobbes is going towards. Right? That we have this reason, this capability to reason, right? And he's enmeshed with this whole enlightenment and intellectual movements, right? Francis Bacon is around. We have people such as Descartes. He's very he's aware of these movements. He's part of this movement, right? So he's applying rationality to politics here. What's Hobbes is doing? This is political philosophy, applying rationality to politics, to how to run society. So we make a contract with each other in the name of self-interest and self-preservation, right? We agree to turn over my autonomy, to stab you and get that apple for myself, and instead, in my freedom, that power that I have, and instead I give that freedom, right? And I give it up instead to just a contract. Who's gonna that everybody is gonna agree to the contract and apply to the terms of the contract? The Leviathan, a big government that's going to control me and my arch enemy that wants that apple. Right? So we need to create a government, this Leviathan, that we give the power, right? We give up our power, our freedoms, our liberties, right? To this Leviathan, to this government authority, so that the Leviathan serves this contract, makes sure that people are abiding by the contract, and nobody is not doing its due, their own due, right? So it's distributive justice. And how do we distribute justice? By this Leviathan, this big tentacle thing that just controls our lives. So this authority, this Leviathan has, is justified by us. We give it legitimacy. Right? So for Hobbes, justice is just a matter of keeping contracts, keeping these agreements. And the only way to ensure that these agreements, these covenants, are kept is to let the Leviathan reign supreme. Right? So Leviathan has supreme authority over everybody. Right? And yeah, there's some critics that say, well, yeah, well, this is what about if the Leviathan abuses his power? And Hobbes' response that, you know what, that's better than going to anarchy. You know, it's more reasonable to have a big, powerful Leviathan than returning back to the state of nature. So he says that I'd rather have, maybe an abusive king than going back to the state of nature. That's basically his response to that criticism. Right, so he's all about authority, right? His Hobbesian view of politics is very about centralizing authority to control people, to make sure they're doing their due. All right. On the other side of this view, we have John Locke. All right. John Locke. There we go. Kind of zoomed in for a while. So John Locke also takes up this contractarianism to political science, to politics, the social contract, and for the most part, he does kind of agree with Thomas Hobbes, right? He definitely agrees that reason is what enables people to see, right, that forming a state, that forming some kind of government is the best way for our own self-preservation and our own self-interest. The second thing he agrees with Hobbes is that it should be consensual. Right? These agreements between the state and the people should be based on consent. It should not be based on force. And the third thing that he agrees is that this consent is justified by the governed. So those are the three main principles that John Locke does take up from Hobbes and agrees with. But beyond that, they are very starkly different. One of the main differences is that John Locke takes a more optimistic approach to human nature. He does believe that human nature is not nasty and brutish and short and stuff. He thinks that people are more prone to be in harmony, to being harmonious. But the biggest difference between John Locke and Thomas Hobbes is that John Locke believes in the idea of inalienable rights. I'm sure you heard this phrase before because it's written in the very foundation, the Constitution of our United States. Right, these inalienable rights. Right, what is it? Freedom, property, the pursuit of happiness, whatever it says in the Declaration of Independence. So basically, what the Declaration of Independence is citing is John Locke. I forgot what it says. I'm gonna see if I have my. But anyways, what John Locke is stating here, contrary to what to what Hobbes thinks, right? So for Hobbes, for Hobbes, you have to create a government first, and then you have rights. So you got to create a Leviathan that's all powerful to give you the rights, to distribute the rights to you, to give you the benefits and the burdens of society. For John Locke, it's kind of like that, but first of all, there's some certain rights that are always there, that no government creates. Right? These certain rights are just inalienable. No government can create or take away. They're just God-given rights. They've always been there. Right? So life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? Big fucking phrase in the Declaration of Independence. And this is Thomas Jefferson who wrote this Declaration of Independence. right? That we are declaring independence from Great Britain. This is America, because we want life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Right? These three rights, right, are taken from John Locke's. What's what's the name of the book here? I'm trying to figure it out. Treatise on Government. I should know this by hand. Can't believe I don't. Yeah, two treatises on government. Something of a treaty on government, basically. So here, let's see. Two treatises of government. Yeah, published in 1690. I had to get that for a while. It was bugging me. Sorry. So big difference, right? So this inalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. For John Locke, in the original, in the 1690 version of the two treatises of government, it's not like the pursuit of happiness. The basis for happiness, according to these people, and Thomas Jefferson and the founding fathers will agree, is property. So in John Locke, in the two treatises of government, he states life, liberty, and property. These three things: life, liberty, and property. I'm fucking repeating this, so it might be pretty important. Life, liberty, and property. These three rights are inalienable. No government, no Leviathan creates them or takes them away. These are our God-given rights. That's one of the main differences between John Locke and Thomas Hobbes. So humans create a government, yes, right? And they cede some power to it. They give up some power, like in Hobbes' view. In return, this government that we created protects these rights and liberties. The state serves the people, not the other way around, as Hobbes would see it. That we serve the state, so the state can distribute the benefits. The state serves us. So this implies, or not implies, but this explicitly says in the two treatises of government, that if the government does become abusive and does not do its job, basically, we have the right to get rid of it and put a new one that's going to do a better job. Right? So this whole idea of John Locke, what he's attempting to do, he's attempting to reconcile or to connect, link up, to coordinate, to harmonize natural moral philosophy or moral law, right? What's right, what's wrong, according to just morality, with actual, I guess, positivist law, positivist law, or the law that humans make, the laws of the land. So he's trying to link those two things up together. So how do we do that? So what we need is the idea of God-given rights, inalienable rights. We also need what he calls impartial judges, judges that are going to apply the law, right? Are going to judge without bias, impartially. Then, lastly, also we need power needs to be in the state, right? The state does have to be powerful enough to enforce these laws. Right? Although we do have the choice to change the law, to change the government. I mean, if it does not do its job, nonetheless, that government still has the power to enforce the laws. Right? So it's this balance between, right, who has power? Is it in the hands of the people or in the hands of the state? And that's basically John Locke's political philosophy. So, so it's about distributive justice. How do we distribute the goods, the benefits, and the burdens among members of society equally? Right? Hobbes takes a more authoritarian approach with the Leviathan, and John Locke takes a more Republican approach. It doesn't because, like I said, Thomas Hobbes was a royalist sympathizer. He was part of the monarchy. He actually tutored a lot of kings and stuff. John Locke, his father was a big supporter of the Parliament, of the parliamentarians. John Locke also had to flee England when the monarchy was restored, when the royalists won the Civil War for a while, and he went to Amsterdam for a while. He went to Holland, and there in Holland, John Locke, he was actually a tutor for the king, and who would become king and queen of England later, who are these the William and Mary of Orange. And then the Glorious Revolution happened. We kicked out the king. I think it was King Stuart or something, one of the Stuarts, and we put in place finally parliament in power. However, we needed to have the symbol, right? We needed to a compromise was made. So Parliament was in power, but we still have a king. But we need an outsider king who's not going to want to retake land and centralize land. So we chose William and Mary of Orange from the Netherlands to be England's king. It's a weird fucking history there. But basically, long story short, John Locke was a sympathizer of our Parliament, whereas Thomas Hobbes was sympathizer of the Royalist. So that kind of explains, or helps explain, the different approaches to the social contract. Whereas for Hobbes, you give up your power, you give up your freedom completely to the Leviathan, to the government, to the king, per se, right? Because he's a royalist, he believes in the king. Whereas Locke, who doesn't believe in the king, he believes in the Parliament. He's like, no, we need to. There's going to be some limits on the power that these people have, the government has. And if they're not doing the jobs, we could rebel and put in place and replace this government. And then beyond that, more importantly, guys, we have these rights, right? Life, liberty, and property that no government at all could take. And so this is the difference between John Locke's and Thomas Hobbes' political philosophies. Now let's move on to their epistemology. So Thomas Hobbes also was an empiricist, one of the first empiricists. He did believe, basically, what he believed was that everything in the world, including humans, consists of bodies in motion. Everything is these bodies in motion. Thus, knowledge of the world begins with sensation, with feeling or touching or smelling or seeing these bodies in motion. These bodies in motion outside of a person cause motion within the person. So we first see all these bodies in motion outside. We sense them, we experience them, and then we make some of these things. Then we reflect, we appercept. There's apperception going on here, and then we make knowledge. And this is like the basic empiricist approach to knowledge. We first experience things, and then we internalize them and make knowledge of them. Okay. So, for example, what Hobbes calls the decaying sense is what we call memories, imagination, and these other mental phenomena. Right? These are the aftershocks of sensations. And willing, says Hobbes, or will, or free will, is that beginning of motion that leads to action when we are moved by other bodies outside of us. So that's like a very basic summary of Hobbes' system. It's very simplistic, basically. John Locke develops it a bit further. So we'll take more time with John Locke. So John Locke, in his essay concerning human understanding, where's John Locke at? And this one was published in 1690 as well, same year that the other book was published. That's pretty tremendous. I just noticed that. That's fucking tremendous. Props to John Locke for that. Right, so he also takes this empiricist approach. Like this, so that's what he's called a British empiricist. These people are mostly British who take this approach. For example, René Descartes, who is a rationalist. He's French. Spinoza, he is technically he's Spanish, but he's forced to flee Spain and then he goes to Amsterdam. So he's kind of like he's from Holland, you could say. Leibniz is German, right? And these people take a different approach from the empiricists. So empiricism is really, really popular with the British Enlightenment figures. So there are people like George Berkeley, David Hume, and John Locke. So Locke argues that we can know much, not everything, but a lot, about the external, about things external to our minds. So how does Locke get to this point? How does Locke get to his own empiricism? He first begins his essay concerning human understanding by refuting rationalism. He first says, you know what, there's no universal principles, there's no innate knowledge, as Descartes says. Right? There's no already knowledge built in, or like Plato says. Right? Remember Meno and the slave and the geometry problem? There is no such thing like that. There is no innate knowledge. All these universal principles that you guys are claiming about innate knowledge, that could be explained by empiricism. And as a matter of fact, says Locke, empiricism, using Occam's razor, is the more simplistic theory and the one that makes more sense. Honestly, guys, this is John Locke talking, right? You could easily explain what you guys are explaining with rationalism better with empiricist approach. So that's like the first part of John Locke's essay concerning human understanding, his edifice of empiricism. So for him, right, there's no innate knowledge, guys. There's no universal principles that everybody has innately, even when we're first born. Right? But for Locke, the mind does not come in the world already inscribed with things, right? Or ideas or knowledge. We have tabula rasa. This is pretty important. A blank slate. We are this blank, empty tablet, basically. And experience and it gets filled in with knowledge via experience. So we are born blank with nothing. And then as we grow and we experience things, our minds get filled with ideas and knowledge, right? We don't come already with knowledge built in with us. We're just blank from day one. It's experience that fills in this blank state, this blank slate. Right? So our mind is like a white paper, he says. So he uses the analogy of a white paper, devoid of any ideas, until sense experiences give it content. All our knowledge is founded upon sense experience, according to John Locke. There's no need to have innate ideas. So, like for example, infinity. Right? The rationalist says, how do you explain the notion of infinity if you never experience infinity? It's a pretty good criticism against the empiricist. If you never experience infinity, how can you make a claim about infinity? How do we know the concept of infinity? Obviously, says the rationalist, Descartes, for example, infinity is an innate idea. It just comes naturally in our heads, just innately. And John Locke is like, no, that's wrong. We don't have nothing when we're born. This is what's going on here. The way we know infinity is because we know finite. Right? We know finite things. We know the opposite of infinity is finite. Infinity, or the infinite, and then the finite. So we know finite things. We know we could count a lot of rocks, a lot of twigs, a lot of sticks, a lot of whatever, horses, whatever. And we could like create, we could like combine and multiply the finite, we could multiply it a lot to get to the concept of infinity. So via the finite, we could get to the infinity, says John Locke. So by having first a sense experience that relates to infinity, and then extrapolating this idea from the sense experience. Right? So extrapolating from the finite the idea of infinity. Right? But it's all based on this, and then we can get to that. Right? So first it's all based on sense experience, and then right through experiencing the finite things. So everything is finite here in the world. Right? Everything is not infinite. By experiencing the finite, and then I can extrapolate. I can then kind of like, conceptualize the infinite. For example, we could multiply and extend, right, the concept of finite things until our imagination approaches the idea of the infinite. That's how he goes around. John Locke goes around this. That infinity and stuff like that is not just a base. Rationalism, an innate idea. It's based upon sense experience first. To be sure, though, John Locke says that there's a difference between external objects and what he calls external objects and then internal ideas. And there's like a big, I guess, like two worlds in a sense, like the world of the outside and then the world of my mind. There's kind of like a separation there, and it's like through empiricism, through his links here, that he makes that coordination, that link through ideas. And so first we have our sense experience, right? Just sense data, just raw sense data, right? Just super raw sense data, and then we have ideas, and then we make relations of these ideas, and then we have concepts, right? So for John Locke, he does concede basically that we do have direct knowledge, not of external objects themselves. Right? Like for example, there's a water bottle here that I have here. I don't really have knowledge of the bottle itself. I have knowledge of the sensations that I get from when I touch it, when I drink from it, when I smell it, or whatever. But I really don't have direct knowledge of the external object. I just have direct knowledge of the sensation I get from interaction with this external object. But the sense data is what it is. And here's another criticism that he approaches in his book. But if all we really know is just sense data, how can we be sure that they give us, right, the sense data give us an accurate picture of reality? How do we know that the sense data really corresponds with the actual existence of the object, this external object? Right. For all I know, this might not be poisoned, right? Whatever, the actual thing. Right. What makes H2O? Right. If you drink H2O, you're good. But if you add another number to the formula, it becomes poison, right? If it's H2O2, right, you might die and shouldn't drink that. So, right, what if it's that, right? How do I know, right? If all I know is just sensations, how do I really know that the sensations correspond with the actual external object? So this is what Locke response answer is, that sensations, the sensations caused by these external objects, the sense data that I get, are what he calls resemblances. It's not the same thing. They're not directly experiencing. Oh man, I can't write no more. It's perfect. Resemblances of these external things. Right? We don't have direct knowledge of them, but via these resemblances, right? This sense data does resemble this object somehow. Right? we could know knowledge. So not all our sensations faithfully reflect reality. He does admit to that. Right? Some sensations do fail us, but the way that we could get to reality of these external objects via our sense data alone is by knowing that there's two kinds of properties that external objects have. So these external objects, right? So reality out there outside of us, all these bodies, all these objects have two things, two properties, two main properties: primary qualities and secondary qualities. Hold on, right? Can't. God. So primary qualities and secondary qualities. Primary qualities are the objective properties of the object. Right? This is what you cannot change these things. The object just comes with this. These are things like size, solidity, and mobility. There are basically, in other words, independent of our senses, these primary qualities. Right? For example, if I leave this room, the size and the solidity and the mobility of this won't change. It's going to stay the same. Right? These are properties that the object possesses without our interaction. It's just what the object itself has. It's part of its ontology. And then secondary qualities are the subjective properties of the object. For example, in the apple example earlier with Hobbes, right? It's red and it's sweet when I bite into it, when I see it. Right? When I see it, it's red. And when I bite into it, it's sweet. Those properties of redness, the sweetness, those don't really belong to the apple, to the object itself. Those are subjective properties. Those are properties that I am assuming are there, are making. Right? These are in the mind, John Locke says. They exist only, right? Redness and sweetness only exist when someone experiences redness and sweetness. But the size of the apple, right, the solidity of the apple, and the fact that it's there, like hanging in the tree, that fact exists independently of someone's experiences. Right? So there's primary qualities and secondary qualities. For John Locke, then, we can have objective knowledge of material objects out there in the world, of the external world, because some of our sense data represents the object's primary qualities. So some of our secondary qualities that we experience, some of the sense data that we experience, redness, does correspond correctly with the primary qualities, which are objective characteristics, so which is reality. So that's kind of like the bridge he has, right? To go from things in my mind to the external world. Like, right? How do I know things are real? Right? Because of these resemblances do have to kind of sometimes correspond to the actual real. So that's John Locke. And I guess, there's still a lot of criticism with that, right? Basically what he's doing is basically jumping from our own subjective point of view, right? Our secondary, our experience of secondary qualities to primary qualities. He's making a big jump there. That's the main criticism there. Because all we could experience is just sense data. So how do we know really for real that sense data is corresponding to the external world? Right? How do we actually make that jump there? So the next philosopher takes up that problem. Right? So just like Hobbes and John Locke, George Berkeley also agrees with empiricism. Right? It's all based upon that reality is all about bodies in motion, and that the basis of all knowledge is experience. He does agree with that. He does reject the skepticism. But for Berkeley, actually, these material bodies that we see out there in the external world are not really there, actually. There's no material objects, actually, he says, Berkeley. So he takes a pretty radical turn here from the empiricist. It's not skepticism, it's just a different kind of empiricism. So for Berkeley, there are no material objects, no things that exist in the external world. There are objects, right, for sure. And there is a water bottle here and a bunch of books around me, right, for sure, that's for sure. But they exist only as sensations, says Berkeley, or what he calls ideas in someone's mind. What makes them real, what makes things real, says Berkeley, is that we are experiencing them, that we experience them, that it's being perceived by someone. Ese es percipi. That's his main principle. Ese es percipi. To be is to be perceived. To exist, right, is to be perceived. To be real is because you're being perceived by someone. So what we usually call physical objects then are just simply this compilation of the sense data, this raw sense data, and what we call reality is just no more than ideas in our minds when we perceive these things. So when we perceive something, we create ideas, and that's the reality. That's all reality. It's all reality we have. Is the ideas. There's no external object over there, right? What makes reality is that we're perceiving something, we make an idea of something. That's Berkeley. So there's no gap, right, between, I guess, sensations, right, this raw sense data, and reality. They're one and the same. For John Locke, there is a gap. There is a difference there between sensations, sense data, and reality, external objects. How do we link them up? With John Locke, resemblances. Right? These resemblances have to somehow mirror or correspond to reality. There's a big gap there. And that resemblance idea is still kind of not well founded. Right? Berkeley, he doesn't have the problem of a gap between sensations and reality. Sensations are reality. It's one and the same thing. Objects, right? Material objects, external objects do not exist, says Berkeley. Only ideas exist along with the minds that perceive them. Right. And he also refutes the distinction between primary qualities and secondary qualities. George Berkeley says that they're the same thing. One and the same again. So a better way to, I guess, illustrate Berkeley's idea here is with the famous riddle about if a tree falls in the forest and nobody sees it or hears it, does it really happen? Right. So if a tree falls in the forest and nobody's there, did it really fall? Right. According to Berkeley, right, at first hand for Berkeley, it would be like no, right? Nobody perceived it, right? To be perceived is to exist. So if nobody perceives something, nobody's experienced it, then no, it doesn't exist. But he gets away from that criticism, right? So one of the criticism was like this. So okay, Berkeley. So to be perceived, esse es percipi, right? To be perceived is to be real, to exist. So what happens when I fall asleep? I'm not perceiving anything. Do I just stop existing, right? Or when I'm alone, or when we're in the classroom, right? When we're in the classroom, we are perceiving the classroom, the whiteboard, the computer, whatever, the clock, the walls, right? It exists. The classroom exists. But once nobody is there, does it just cease to exist because nobody's perceiving the classroom? Right? It doesn't make kind of sense, right? And George Berkeley is like, no, guy. Like, of course, the tree does exist and nobody's there. And of course, the classroom still exists when somebody leaves the classroom and nobody's there to receive it, because there's God. God is all seeing, all knowing, and all everything. God is the one that's always seeing the world. So God is the one that's always experiencing things. So when the tree falls in the forest and there's nobody there to experience it, it does exist. It did fall because God was there to experience it. When we leave the classroom and nobody's there to experience a classroom, the classroom doesn't just simply disappear. God is there to maintain, right, this harmony. So that's Berkeley. Let's move on to David Hume. Um, so David Hume, right, also dealing with the question: do we have knowledge then? What is knowledge? Right? He was not convinced with Hobbes, not convinced with John Locke, and not convinced, definitely not convinced with George Berkeley. So Hume insists that he just kind of goes away. He just goes wild. Question, this epistemological question of what is knowledge. And I guess I give you a little bit of background on Hume. I have Hume here. I have Hume summary here. So he's actually from Scotland. He's Scottish. All right. So he's from Edinburgh, Scotland. He was born in 1711. A pretty well-off family. His father was a lawyer, although he died when he was only 2 years old. The father died, so he was raised mostly by his mom and his grandmother. By the age of 12, he enrolls in the University of Edinburgh. So very, very smart kid. And he was raised in a very strict Catholic, not Catholic, yeah, was it Catholic? Or very religious upbringing. But once he gets to university, he becomes basically an atheist. He just announces religion. He kind of goes into like an existential crisis, like Descartes did when he got out of university. It's like, who do I believe? Right? Everything's bullshit. What's real? Right? So he kind of goes into the same crisis. Totally loses faith in religion for sure. And he becomes very critical of religion afterwards, for the rest of his life, basically. He actually is a big fan of Descartes. He moves to where Descartes lived in La Flèche in France. Uh, there he studied. That's where he wrote uh, most of his first publications. For example, a treatise on human nature. He wrote that there. He wrote a book on Descartes, actually, refuting Descartes, but he wrote a book about Descartes, how he's wrong. But his most important book is called a book called An Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding. This was published in 1748. And basically, it's a compilation of his earlier works and adding more stuff. So he's like refining his philosophy here. And it's all about refuting both rationalism and empiricism, pretty much showing how everybody before him is wrong. Hume is a really, really fascinating character. He was always well liked. Everybody liked him. He was all about having a good time. Right? So he was like, yes, what was the balance that he has between, right? It's good to be intellectually morose, but you gotta be happy. Like you gotta be intellectually morose, but passionately happy. Right? So you gotta let your passion sometimes let it be, and just be. Right? Don't always be intellectual about stuff, because then you'll always be morose and unhappy. So not everything is about the intellect. Not everything is about reason, basically. He's kind of out there, kind of pretty cool guy. Of all these philosophers we're talking about, I would most like to meet David Hume if I had the chance. Seems like a really nice guy. But let's talk about Hughes Epistemology. So, Hume agrees that there's no innate knowledge, right? So he outright does reject rationalism. No such thing as innate knowledge. All knowledge does come from sensory experience, from sense data. But according to Hume, there are all these perceptions, all this sense data that we get, all this raw sense data that we receive, all these perceptions of the mind are divided into two categories. Into two categories. What categories should I begin with? Impressions or ideas? So yeah, so Hume insists that whatever knowledge we have is of two kinds: relations of ideas and matters of fact. So relations of ideas and matters of fact. Jesus Christ. But then matters of fact. Matters of fact and relations of ideas. So relations of ideas are just these logical mathematical truths. These propositional logic, basically. Examples are like either it's raining or not raining. No bachelors are married. These relations of ideas are derived by reason. Okay? Because here he's nodding to the rationalist. Okay, we do gain knowledge sometimes through relations of ideas, which just are ideas, right? Truths of mathematics and truth of logics. Matters of fact, on the other hand, consists of information about the world and is based entirely on sense experience. So relations of ideas are based entirely upon rationality, on reason, and matters of fact are based entirely on empiricism, on sense experience. So, in other words, the relations of ideas, what we know by reason, we know certainly that all bachelors are unmarried. Right? We're using logic, right? A bachelor is an unmarried man. So all bachelors are unmarried. That's a relation of idea example. Or the proposition that it's either raining or not raining. Right? So this knowledge, we do know by certainty that it's either raining or not raining. It's not raining. Certainly it's not raining. It's sunny outside, actually. And I know that by certainty. Right? Or that I know for sure that 2 plus 2 equals 4. I'm certain of that. I don't have to go out there and experience it. I'm certain of that. But does that really give us does it really help us to learn anything about the world? Hume says no, not really. Right? They're kind of, I mean, they're helpful, right, for math and logic, but beyond that, it doesn't really give us nothing about the world. Matters of fact, though, this knowledge that we get via sense experience does tell us about the world. Right? If I go outside, it's a bit sunny, but is it cold or is it hot? I'm not too sure, right? I have to go outside and check. Right? Or I guess I could go and check the weather, but somebody out there had to experience, whether it was little mechanism or so, or a weatherman, and says, okay, it's hot, it's 85 degrees outside, or something, whatever. Right? Now we know something about reality. Now we have information about reality. Right? This is useful stuff now. Right? So the most useful knowledge is based upon our sense experience. Okay? These matters of fact. It's informative about the world. But we cannot be known for certain that that's the case. It could change. The weather could change from 85 to 70. Right? If a cloud comes and rain comes, it could easily change, or whatever. Right? We have no certainty on matters of fact, on this knowledge based on sense experience. Right? So you see the two distinctions here that we're making here with Hume. So how much can we really know then about reality, about the world then? Through experience alone. That is, What can we know with just these matters of fact? And Hume agrees, absolutely very little. Not much we can learn about these either, because it's not certain. The information that we get from experience, it's what he calls perceptions. We just perceive these things, perceptions. This perceptions, this category of perceptions, it consists of sense data in our, what he calls inner psychological states. So here he's trying to psychologize epistemology. He's trying to explain how we gain knowledge, not just through reason, but with a more psychological lens. Psyche, right? Emotions, passions, right? He does involve these things. He says like these passions and these emotions are a very important part of how we gain knowledge, and we need to take into account these things. And this is what these inner psychological states are, right? So perceptions, right? So we experience stuff, and then I perceive. I have perceptions of my room here, living room, and that perception that I have of this room here is based upon two main things: my sense data, right? The seeing, right? The odor, I'm gonna say what it smells like, the sounds, right? What I receive from my sense data, and then my inner psychological state. So I've been drinking coffee, so I'm a little bit wired, right? Um, I sleep in during this time period here, this difficult time with the COVID, right? This online teaching, I can sleep in, so I'm really well rested. So I'm feeling pretty good, right? My inner psychological state, I'm pretty happy, right? There's no hate, there's no fear, right? There's maybe a little bit nervous, but you know. So there's these perceptions of these two things: sense data and my psychological state, right? Besides perceptions, but these perceptions come in twos, come in two different flavors, I guess, just two different categories. They come in what he calls impressions and ideas. So according to Hume, all the perceptions of the mind is divided into these two types: impressions and ideas. Using this empirical distinction, Hume believes that impressions to be more lively, to be more closer to reality, I guess you could say, than ideas. So impressions and ideas. So this is the way it is. So first I'm perceiving things. I'm in my room and I have an impression of it. My first impression, basically. And then after my first impression, I reflect on it and then I make an idea of it. Right? So I'm looking at my other couch over here in front of me. You guys can't see it, but in front of me there's a couch. And I'm like, okay, first I just see the couch, the impression. And then I make an idea of it. It's like, oh my God, it's dirty. I should probably clean it. Right? So first it's just the impression. It's lively. It's just there. It's the raw sense data. It's just hitting you in the face. Right? You're just receiving the data, the sense data. And then you make an idea of it. You make an idea of that impression. Right? So the impression is more lively. It's more vivid in your mind. And then you reflect on that impression, right? This apperception, and then you make an idea of it. So when you look at a red rose, right, the experience of the color, of the brightness of red, that's the impression. But your thoughts, right, or what you imagine about that rose after you see the impression, that's the idea. So when you see a red rose, you see it and it's red. That's the impression. And then you make, oh, maybe it reminds you of maybe, I don't know, a funeral, maybe, right? Or maybe a date, Valentine's Day or something, or a beautiful time. That's the idea of the object. And so you have an impression of the object and then the idea of the object, right? So this is the power of our perception, of reflecting, of self-reflection. Uh, all right, so for Hume then, for something to count as knowledge, it must be based on impressions or on ideas that are derived from impressions. So something to be meaningful, according to Hume, it must ultimately refer to an impression, reality, this raw sense data. And then how can we be sure that these perceptions, these impressions, these impressions and these ideas actually are corresponding to the truth of reality out there, to the external world? And he says, you can't. We don't know. Therein lies the skepticism, David Hume's skepticism. We can only be sure of my perceptions, right, which contains impressions and ideas. That's the only thing I can be sure of. If it corresponds to reality, sepa, je ne sais pas, right? That's where you get the word, the Spanish phrase sepa from the French, je ne sais pas, I don't know, right? It says Hume. The only thing I can be sure of is my impression that's vivid and lively, and then the idea that I have. It's a little bit more dull, but it's still my own. It's based on the impression. This perception, right? This method of perception. That's all I can be sure of. All I know is just my experience, and whatever lies beyond my experience, anybody's guess. We don't know. We just simply don't have the capacity to know. This is skepticism. So the strict empiricism that leads to skepticism for David Hume pivots around the central notion of causality, of cause and effect, right? So for Berkeley, and for John Locke especially, right, there's the thing of cause and effect kind of thing between primary and secondary qualities, and therefore I know reality. Because I have secondary qualities, my sense data, this is Locke, I have the sense data via secondary qualities, and these secondary qualities allow me like a window into the primary quality, and that primary quality is a representation of reality. That's John Locke in a nutshell, right? Hume is like, no, right? There is no like cause and effect. There's no chain of causality here, right? There's no cause and effect at all, right? So what is cause and effect? What is causality, right? So we believe the world is filled with cause and effects, that one thing causes another, right? Think about Aristotle here, right? Think about, right, the Aquinas, right? One thing causes another, that two things somehow are related, somehow are relational. Right? When it's nighttime, I turn on the switch, and the light turns on. Cause and effect, right? What caused the light to turn on? Me turning the switch light on. But what happens if there's like a blackout, right? If the power generators go out, or if my light bulb goes out, the switch now didn't cause nothing. So there's no cause and effect there no more, right? So how can I say that the switch light caused the light to go on in the first place? What I made was I made an inference that there was a cause and effect from the switch light to the light being on, based out of habit. Right? For the longest time, every time I switch the light on, the light goes on. But lo and behold, one day the light bulb se funde. It goes off. So when I turn on the light switch, nothing goes on. So I'm like, what the fuck's going on then? Right? Where's the cause and effect here? Right? All I made was all that we had. I was for the longest time, right, so used to, right? It was a habit that I had to think that the light switch caused the light to go on, but that was not the case. This is the same thing with all knowledge here, but just cause and effect everywhere. All we can make is just habits of the mind, David Hume says. There is no cause and effect. It's just habits of the mind. It's just we get used to things happening right after the other, that we just automatically say, okay, that must be certain cause and effect. But there is no cause and effect. All there is are these necessary connections, right? This cause and effect that he calls. It's just habits of the mind. Think about like a billboard when we're playing pool, billboards, billiards. I mean billboards, billiards. You're playing pool. Right, so there's a cue ball, and there's all the other balls with the different colors and different numbers. Right. So when I hit the cue ball, right, the cue ball then creates an effect and hits the other balls when I break, and the other ball is dispersed across the pool table. Right. But is there a cause and effect there? Is there really a cause and effect there? But Hume says like no, we perceive it, there's a perception of that, but there is no true cause and effect. Right? What there is, there's the cue ball, right? And then it does make contact with other balls, and then there's motion, right? But that's all there is. It's just motion. There's no cause and effect, for sure. Kind of what I'm trying to get at here. There is no necessary connection between the cue ball when it hits the other ball to break the other balls. Sometimes when you hit the cue ball and you hit the other ball, it doesn't do anything sometimes, right? That could happen, right? There's no certainty in this cause and effect. And this is a problem of induction. So for Hume, there's neither reason alone, no experience alone can provide us with enough evidence to prove that cause and effect exist. All we observe, all that we perceive, says Hume, is one event associated with another. And when we repeatedly see such a pairing, we jump the gun and we jump to the conclusion that these events are causally connected. We make these inferences out of habit, says Hume, and not logic or empirical evidence. It's just habits of the mind. Again, cause and effect, it's a habit of the mind. So when we make judgments about this causality of cause and effect, we're using induction, he says. Right? In induction, remember, inductive reasoning is not certain; it's just probable at best. Right? So when we reason inductively, right, we assume that when one event follows the other in the past, we assume that's going to happen in the future. That's what cause and effect really is about. So we're already presupposing this principle of induction. Because all our previous experiences have told us one way it's going to be the case, we expect it to be the case in the future as well. Which reason or empirical evidence doesn't for certain give you certainty on that conclusion. Think about Pavlov and conditioning. We're talking about psychology here, right? So Pavlov was a Russian scientist, and he had this experiment where he would ring a bell, bing, 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 and he had a dog, right? And every time he would ring the bell, he would feed the dog. So ring the bell, bring out the food for the dog. And he did it constantly. So when every time he would just ring the bell, the dog would salivate, right? Because it was feeding time, right? The dog created this causal connection, right? Cause and effect, right? Bell means food, bam, right? And that's all we're doing, says Hume. We're just being conditioned, right? This is a habit that we're making in the minds, being conditioned here to say that it's effect. When we say something is cause and effect, when it's causally connected, there is no necessary connections in things, right? Just because one event follows into the other almost all the time in the past doesn't mean that's going to happen in the future for sure. It might happen. It might continue to happen that way. But there's no certainty, right? Nothing, neither reason nor logic nor empirical evidence can give you enough evidence to say that for certain that's going to happen. That for certain the bell is going to ring and there's going to be food, right? So that's what Pavlov did. One time he rang the bell. It's kind of fucked up, right? The dog was expecting food and there was no food. The dog was like, what the fuck, going crazy, right? And this is what happens to humans, right? This is how our minds are kind of like pre-programmed, right? We're habitual animals, right? Habits of the minds. Right, so that's David Hume. let's move on to Spinoza and to Leibniz. This is a long ass fucking lecture. All right, so I'm trying to go a little bit quickly with these two dudes because you can tell I'm talking forever about this stuff. So Baruch, or you chose the word Benedictus, Spinoza. Well, he's a neo-Aristotelian, right? He's taking Aristotle to the next level, right? So he is a rationalist, right? He's not really an empiricist. And what is his main thing? So he's about ontology. What is something? What is being? What makes something be? And he takes a different approach from most people do at his own time. His background is fascinating. I really don't have. I think I should spend time on that. But he was excommunicated by. He was born a Jew, and they kicked him out. The Jewish community excommunicated from the Jewish, and then he went with the Christians, and the Christians also didn't like him, so he was just radical for everywhere he went. He ended up in Brussels, I believe, where it was a little bit more intellectually tolerant than anywhere else in Europe. So he was always kind of on the run until he landed in Brussels. All right, so he didn't write much either. He has one big magnus opus called The Ethics, and this was published posthumously after he died. And in The Ethics, he's a rationalist, and he takes up Descartes' not method of geometry, but the form of geometrical argumentation. So in the ethics, it gives you like a proof, and then it gives you axioms that prove the proof. Right? Just like in math, you get a proof, and then you have to create little theories to create a theorem, right? Or axioms to create a theorem. Right? So he takes a very geometrical, rationalist approach to his philosophy. This is fascinating stuff. Right? So he develops propositions from axioms and definitions. Right? Very, very logical, very rationalist approach. Okay, so how do I explain Spinoza? It's kind of complex here. I'm really not too happy in how the textbook explains it, but I'm trying my best here. All right, so Aristotle is all about substance. Remember about Aristotle? The lectures on Aristotle is about substance. And how do we know about substance? What is substance? Right? It's about ontology. There's form, there's motion, there's all these things that make substance. So for Descartes, remember Descartes, there's two kinds of substances, body and mind. There's a dualism involved with Descartes. There's this dichotomy, right? The material and the mental, right? For Spinoza, however, there's only one substance, right? It is an infinite substance, just like in Descartes, the mind is this infinite substance, but he also adds, right? He has res extens and res cogitans, right? So the res cogitans is this infinite substance, is the mind, the thinking thing, and then there's the thing, the material thing, the res extens, right? So this dualism, right? The whole being, the whole metaphysics of everything of to be is broken in two for Descartes: the mind, the res cogitans, and then the body, the res extens, right? And the mind is an infinite substance; it's infinite. The res extens, it's a body, it decays and wherever, but the mind is infinite. Spinoza agrees with this. There is an infinite substance, the mind, but he does not break it in two. He's a monist. It's monism. There's only one infinite substance, and it's completely independent and necessary as well. And this necessary and infinite substance could only be God. God, right, is this infinite one substance that makes up his monism, this Spinoza's monism. God exists necessarily, according to Spinoza, and as God is and if God is the only substance, then what we call nature, that must be God. Spinoza here is developing a pantheism, Right? So pantheism is a view that God is the same as nature, is identical with everything. Right? So God is everything. Actually, to be more precise, he's more of a panentheist than a pantheist. Spinoza is more of a panentheist, that God is nature, but God is also more than nature as well. Right? And the pantheist, it shows that God is nature. It's identical with everything. Pantheist. So Spinoza's God is infinite, it's eternal, it's immanent. It's not a person, right? It's beyond that. So that's why I'm saying he's a panentheist. It's not a being. It's not a being, right? The supreme being that interacts with humans. It's not that. It's beyond that. Right? But it is just one. It's the basis of everything, though. Right, let me go on. And although God is just one substance, infinite, one monist substance, one, God has infinite attributes, characteristics of God. However, we only know two of them, of these divine attributes. And what are they that we know, according to Spinoza, is thought, mind, right? The ability of thinking, and extension, right? So thought, of which like our minds are just mere modifications of that attribute of God, or that divine attribute, and extension, of which bodies are just one mere modification of that divine attribute of God. But he has way many more that we just don't know. All we know is just those two, though. Okay. So to Spinoza, Descartes was wrong to present mind and body as separate substances. Right? Instead, for Spinoza, body and mind are both attributes of that one substance of God. So the thinking thing, the res cogitans, and the body, the res extens, are really the same thing. There's just different attributes of God. But it is essentially, at the basis of all, it's God. It's one substance. So that's Spinoza right there. I'm not going to go into his ethics because that will take me more time than I want to spend now that I've spent. But basically, if we know God, if we get in touch with God, we free ourselves from passions and from sin. But let's move on to Leibniz. So Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, this motherfucker was brilliant. I mean, he was what we call a polymath. Uh, he was an innovator and one of the pioneering leaders in not just mathematics, but in jurisprudence, which is like law, in history, in politics, in theology, in science, technology. He independently from Newton, he discovered infinitesimal calculus. Okay, so Newton and Leibniz had a big beef uh, during their own lifetimes on who's going to get credit, who discovered calculus. Uh, it's obvious that the charge was that Leibniz copied or that he copied each other, but it's obvious that they didn't contact each other. They have no communication. They're two separate systems, but with the same conclusion, right? Which was the method of calculus. And as a matter of fact, Leibniz system is the one that we actually use today when we teach calculus. So it was a more efficient system. So Leibniz discovered calculus, just like Newton. Leibniz invented a calculator, right, just like the one that we have today, which is just with the basic things, right? Addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, and square root. He invented a machine that does that. And back in the 16, he was born in 1646, so around 1670. So late 17th century, he was inventing a calculator, right? Perhaps one of the first computers ever. What else did he do? He founded a bunch of intellectual societies, the learned societies. Society of the Sciences in Berlin, for example. He was a founder of that. He was a diplomat. He pretty much did everything. He was tremendously bright and very prolific. And just like Spinoza, let's go to his philosophy now, anyways. And I mean, let me give you just one more tidbit about Leibniz. He was born into academia. His father was a philosopher, a professor at the University of Leibniz, not Leibniz, University of, what university did he go to? Leipzig. It's kind of almost like his last name, Leipzig. His mom was a daughter of a law professor there at that university, so he was born into that university, pretty much, into academia. Right? So that's why it explains why he's so bright. He was just surrounded by brilliant people. So just like Spinoza, he's also concerned with the metaphysics of what is substance, what is to be, what makes being, what is the substance of the universe. What is being? Leibniz kind of takes a different approach than Spinoza. So Spinoza, there's one substance, God. God is everything, right? And he has two attributes, thought and extension. That's what makes reality. For Leibniz, on the other hand, there is not just one thing. It's an infinite number of things. And he's bases his things on atomism, right? So there's like these tiny little atoms that make everything, and they're infinite. And they're not like irregular atoms, like Empiricles or these Democritus would say in like this ancient atomism. His atoms are a little bit weird, a little particular. First of all, he calls them monads. Right, so they're not atoms or these things called monads for Leibniz. So there's not an extension or it's not an attribute of God, right? It's these things called monads that we have. So it's this, we need to understand nature as a collection of discrete extended entities, something like atoms, but what he calls monad, or a unit of psychic force. That's what he says. So monads are without parts. They're simple, and they don't interact with each other. It's monads. As he puts it, is they have no windows through which anything may come in or go out. Each monad has within itself an internal principle, an entelechy, that's what we call it, an entelechy, of appetition. Right? It just drives itself internally. Right? So here we're talking about two kinds of principles, right? The internal principles and external principles. What drives something? And there's like three kinds of monads. Right now we're talking about the first most primitive monad. Is a simple monad, which is just driven by appetition. It just kind of drives itself, right? It's driven internally. Let me keep on going. Probably doesn't make any sense now because these monads are kind of hard to explain. So each monad has an internal principle of appetition that causes it to change. And even though there's no interaction, no causal interaction between monads, they appear to influence each other, and they appear to be causing, right? So the monad of, think about the monad of say a rock, right? So a rock has an internal relation to itself, and it also has relations external to itself. So when a rock falls down a hill, and it's rolling down a hill, piece of rock, a little pebble, right? It has external relations to time and space, right? It's moving down the hill, right? It has a relation to space, to the hill, to where it's going. But internally, it's still a rock. Doesn't matter where it lands in the hill. It doesn't matter on the external relations with its surroundings. The rock, when it lands, is still a rock, right? Internally, it's still a rock. So this is the way kind of like he's seeing the universe. Leibniz here. So these are these sips, and we could just quote him. The simple substances, right, that are compound substances, and it's a collection, an aggregatum of these simple substances. That's what everything is. The metaphysics of the universe is an aggregation, a collection, a compilation of these monads that make things exist. Monads are not, there are these units of psychic, I guess, expression. These are what Leibniz calls centers of rudimentary mental processes. Centers of rudimentary mental processes. Specifically, the monads are the seats of perceptions and their changes. So each monad mirrors the entire cosmos through what it perceives itself, through how it relates to itself, right? So this interaction that we presume, this cause and effect between monads, right? There's no interaction. It's what Leibniz calls this pre-established harmony that God gave us. Okay? So God manages these monads and arranges them into this harmonious, intelligible reality. The monads don't interact with each other. It's just like God puts them in order, and that's how we make sense of it, because it's already pre-established. Harmony is already pre-established. So think about like a cell in the body, right? These like monads are like that. So each cell in the body is independent of and distinct from the others. Yet they behave in accordance. Right? So each cell has its own, I guess, genetic kind of like, signature. But when you put the cells together, it creates a human body. But when you go to this particular little cell, each cell is pretty unique. It's independent from the others. But you put them together, and it creates an organism. This is the same thing with the monads, right? And who puts them together? Who creates this organism? It's a pre-established harmony that God gave us. So you have like the monad of a body, right? And you have the monad of a mind. Let's think about it that way. And they seem to interact. They seem to be one and the same, right? And this is the problem that Descartes, with this dualism, said that they're separate. And for Spinoza, the mind and body is just one thing. It's just God. And for Leibniz, is two separate tracks, two separate courses, mind and body. And there's all these monads in there. And they seem to correlate all the time, right? My mind and my body are correlating. But this correlation, this link, this interaction, is this pre-established harmony. Right? It's not really there. It's just already pre-established by God. And that's what creates reality, according to Leibniz, is these monads. I know it's fucking batshit crazy. I'm pretty sure I did a terrible job explaining this, but that's the best I could do. So there's degrees of monads. There's simple monads, and there's like a more intermediate monad, like a soul. And the supreme monad is the soul. The dominant monad is the soul, as opposed to the other naked monads. So you have, and that's what humans have, this soul monad. It has the power of apperception, self-reflection. Anyway, so that's pretty much all I wanted to talk about in this chapter. We're talking about what is reality. Right? So here we're still dealing with this gap between empiricism and rationalism. Right? And none of these philosophers are really accomplishing with dealing with that problem until we get to next chapter, chapter 11, Immanuel Kant. And Immanuel Kant really revolutionizes philosophy for the rest of the course of human history. Because he completely shifts, right? He's a whole paradigm shift in how we think about reality in the mind, right? So we're dealing with that problem. What is reality and what is the mind, and how do they interact, right? And Kant just completely tackles that head on and gives us a brilliant new paradigm, new framework on how to view the world. And that'll be the next lecture, all right? So see you guys around, and I hope I see this one thing. Bye bye.